You sold my house? Mom, please, just let me explain. Explain what? That you sold the home your father and I spent 40 years building? I didn't know what else to do. You could have waited for me. You were sick. I thought I was fighting for my life, Rebecca. While I was lying in that hospital bed wondering if I was going to make it home, you were making sure I had no home to come back to.
Mom, I'm sorry.
I trusted you.
Margaret Ellis had spent 43 years believing that the person she could trust most in this world was her daughter. Rebecca had been there when Margaret's husband died. She had held her mother's hand through hospital visits, brought groceries when Margaret could no longer drive long distances, and promised that she would never let her mother face old age alone. So when Margaret suffered a serious medical emergency, and the doctors told her she needed rehabilitation before returning home, she believed Rebecca when she said the nursing home was only temporary. Margaret thought she was going there to recover. She thought her daughter was protecting her. She thought that somewhere beyond the sterile walls of that facility, her little house in Columbus, Ohio, was waiting for her. The house where she had raised Rebecca. The house where her husband, Thomas, had spent the final decades of his life. The house whose mortgage they had finally paid off after years of sacrifice. But while Margaret was learning how to stand without assistance, something was happening behind her back. Her daughter was preparing to sell the one place Margaret believed could never be taken away from her. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because the day Margaret finally discovered what Rebecca had done, she didn't just lose her home. She discovered that the woman she trusted with her future had been making plans for it without her. And what made the betrayal even harder to understand was that Rebecca hadn't acted like someone trying to steal from her mother. She had acted like a daughter doing exactly what everyone expected a loving daughter to do. She visited Margaret in the hospital. She spoke to the doctors. She arranged the rehabilitation stay. She packed her mother's belongings. And when Margaret asked when she would be coming home, Rebecca always gave the same answer. Soon, Mom. Those two words would eventually become the most painful words Margaret had ever heard. Because Margaret didn't know that while she was waiting to go home, Rebecca was already preparing the house for someone else. Margaret's story had never been about wealth. The house wasn't a mansion, and there was nothing particularly extravagant about it. It was a 2-story home on a quiet street in Columbus, Ohio, with a small front porch, a mature maple tree near the driveway, and a kitchen that Thomas had renovated himself years before. But to Margaret, it was worth more than any price a realtor could put on a piece of paper. She and Thomas had bought the house when Rebecca was only 6 years old. Back then, the neighborhood was still developing, and the house needed work. The carpets were worn, the kitchen cabinets were outdated, and the backyard was little more than uneven grass. But Thomas saw potential. Margaret saw a place where her daughter could grow up safely. Together, they spent years turning that ordinary house into the center of their family life. Every important memory Margaret had seemed to exist somewhere inside those walls. Rebecca's first day of school began at that front door. Her high school graduation photographs were taken beneath the maple tree. Thomas had marked every birthday on the kitchen doorway as Rebecca grew taller, until the wooden frame was covered with little pencil lines and dates. There had been Christmas mornings, Thanksgiving dinners, arguments, reconciliations, and quiet Sunday afternoons, when the three of them would sit around the kitchen table, long after the food had been cleared away. When Thomas died, Margaret couldn't bring herself to change much. His favorite chair remained in the living room, his coffee mug stayed in the cabinet, even the old toolbox he had used for decades remained in the garage. The house wasn't simply where Margaret lived, it was where her entire life had happened. Rebecca had always known what the house meant to her mother. That was why Margaret never suspected what was coming. When Rebecca started visiting more frequently after Thomas died, Margaret interpreted it as love. When Rebecca began asking questions about bills, insurance, property taxes, and the mortgage, Margaret assumed her daughter was simply trying to help. Even when Rebecca occasionally asked how much the house was worth, Margaret didn't think much of it. She would smile and say that the house wasn't going anywhere. She had no plans to sell it. She wanted to stay there for the rest of her life. Rebecca would usually nod and change the subject. Looking back, Margaret would later realize that some of those conversations had been warnings she simply didn't recognize at the time. The change came gradually. Margaret began struggling with everyday tasks she had once handled without thinking. Carrying laundry upstairs became exhausting. Mowing the lawn took longer. Driving at night made her nervous. Still, she refused to leave her home. Rebecca occasionally suggested that Margaret consider moving into a smaller apartment or an assisted living community, but Margaret always rejected the idea. She wasn't ready. She told her daughter that as long as she could still make her own coffee, sleep in her own bedroom, and walk into her backyard whenever she wanted, she wasn't leaving. Rebecca would smile, tell her she understood, and then drop the subject. Margaret believed the matter was settled. Then came the morning everything changed. It was a cold Tuesday in November when Margaret collapsed in her kitchen. She had been making coffee when she suddenly felt dizzy. The mug slipped from her hand and shattered against the floor. She tried to reach for the counter, but her legs gave way. By the time the ambulance arrived, she was conscious but frightened. Rebecca met her at the hospital less than an hour later. She looked worried. She held her mother's hand and kept telling her that everything was going to be okay. Margaret remembered looking at her daughter's face and feeling relieved. In that moment, she didn't think about the house. She didn't think about money. She didn't think about legal documents. She only thought one thing: my daughter is here. The doctors eventually told Margaret that she would need rehabilitation before returning home. She was weak, unsteady, and unable to manage everything by herself. Rebecca sat beside the hospital bed when the doctor explained it. She nodded carefully, asked questions, and told the doctor that she would make sure her mother received whatever care she needed. When Margaret heard the words, rehabilitation facility, fear immediately crossed her face. She didn't want to go anywhere. She wanted her own bedroom. She wanted her own bathroom. She wanted the familiar sound of the refrigerator humming in the kitchen at night. Most of all, she wanted to go home. Rebecca squeezed her hand and promised her that the facility would only be temporary. Margaret looked into her daughter's eyes and believed her. She had no reason not to. At least, that's what she thought. 2 days later, Rebecca packed a small suitcase for her mother. She brought Margaret's favorite cardigan, several pairs of comfortable clothes, her reading glasses, toiletries, and a framed photograph of Thomas. Margaret watched from the hospital bed as her daughter carefully folded everything into the bag. It was a strangely comforting sight. It made Margaret feel as though Rebecca was preparing her for a short trip rather than moving her into a place she feared she might never leave. Before the ambulance transported her to the rehabilitation facility, Rebecca leaned down and kissed her forehead. "Don't worry, Mom. I'll take care of everything." Margaret smiled weakly. She had no idea what everything was about to mean. The rehabilitation facility was nothing like Margaret's home. It was clean, bright, and professionally staffed, but every hallway looked the same. Every door seemed to lead to another room occupied by someone waiting for a phone call, a visitor, or permission to go home. Margaret tried to convince herself that she would only be there for a few weeks. She followed the therapist's instructions, took her medication, and worked hard during her sessions because she had one goal in mind: getting strong enough to return to her house. Every morning, she looked at the small calendar beside her bed and counted the days. Rebecca visited during the first week almost every afternoon. She brought coffee from Margaret's favorite cafe and sometimes sat beside her mother while they watched television. Margaret would ask about the house, and Rebecca always had an answer ready. "Everything is fine, Mom." Those words became Margaret's comfort. She never imagined that they were also hiding something. After the second week, Rebecca's visits became less frequent. At first, Margaret didn't worry. Rebecca said she was busy with work. Then she said she had been dealing with a problem with her car. A few days later, she said she wasn't feeling well. Margaret accepted every explanation because she didn't want to become a burden. She would tell her daughter, "Don't worry about me, I'm doing fine." But she wasn't fine. She missed home. She missed waking up in her own bedroom. She missed opening the curtains and seeing the maple tree outside her window. She missed Thomas. And more than anything, she wanted to walk through her front door again. One evening, she called Rebecca herself. "How is the house?" Margaret asked. There was a pause on the other end of the line. It was only a second or two, but Margaret noticed it. "It's fine," Rebecca finally replied. Margaret smiled to herself. "Good. I can't wait to see it again." What Margaret didn't know was that Rebecca had already begun making changes inside the house. The first thing she did was remove some of Thomas's belongings. She told herself that she was only organizing. The house needed to be cleaned, she said. Margaret had accumulated too many things over the years, and some of them were becoming difficult to manage. Rebecca packed several boxes and moved them into the garage. Then she started going through the paperwork Margaret had kept in a small filing cabinet in the home office. Tax records, insurance documents, utility bills, mortgage statements, property records. Rebecca had never paid much attention to them before. Now she studied every page. The house had no mortgage, the property was entirely paid off, and its estimated value was much higher than she had expected. That number changed the way Rebecca looked at the house. For years, she had seen it as her mother's home. Now, she began seeing it as an asset. And once that happened, the questions started. How could she sell it? Who had the authority to sign the documents? What would happen if Margaret refused? How long would the process take? And most importantly, how much money could she get? Rebecca didn't have all the answers yet, but she knew someone who might. A few days later, a real estate agent named Michael Grant arrived at the house. He didn't come through the front door carrying a sign that said, "For sale." He came quietly, almost casually, as if he were visiting a friend. Rebecca let him in and walked him through the rooms. She showed him the kitchen, the living room, the bedrooms, and the backyard. Michael asked questions about the property's condition and neighborhood. Rebecca answered them carefully. She never once mentioned that her mother was living in a rehabilitation facility. At least, not at first. When Michael finally asked, "Who owns the property?" Rebecca hesitated. "My mother," she said. "And she's okay with selling?" Rebecca looked toward the window. She can't really make those decisions right now. Michael's expression changed. He looked at Rebecca for a moment, before asking the question that would eventually become very important. "Do you have legal authority to act on her behalf?" Rebecca nodded. Yes. What Michael didn't know was that Margaret had never agreed to sell her home. And what Margaret didn't know was that her daughter had just taken the first serious step toward making sure she never returned to it. Rebecca had convinced herself that she was doing something necessary. At first, she told herself the house was too much for Margaret to maintain. Then she told herself that selling it would give her mother enough money to pay for long-term care. But there was another problem Rebecca rarely admitted, even to herself. She was drowning financially. Credit cards had piled up. Her car needed expensive repairs. A personal loan she had taken years earlier was overdue, and the apartment she lived in was becoming difficult to afford. She had spent months trying to keep everything together, and now she saw her mother's paid-off house as the solution to problems that had nothing to do with Margaret's health. She didn't tell herself that she was stealing. She told herself she was borrowing against something that would eventually belong to her anyway. That distinction made it easier for her to continue. The real estate agent returned 2 days later with a valuation. The number was higher than Rebecca expected, nearly $500,000. Rebecca stared at the figure for a long time. She imagined what the money could do. Her debts could disappear. Her car could be replaced. She could move into a better apartment. She could finally stop worrying every time another bill arrived. She knew there would be questions. She knew Margaret might object. But Rebecca also knew her mother was currently in a nursing facility and dependent on other people for basic care. In Rebecca's mind, that gave her time. She could sell the property before Margaret was strong enough to challenge her. She could explain everything later. Maybe, she thought, by the time Margaret understood what had happened, she would accept that there was no other option. But there was one thing Rebecca hadn't considered. Margaret had spent her entire life keeping records. Every major document relating to the house was stored carefully. The original purchase agreement was in a locked filing cabinet. The mortgage records were there. Insurance documents were there. Tax receipts were there. And somewhere among those papers was a document that Rebecca had overlooked. It was something Thomas had arranged years earlier. At the nursing facility, Margaret was beginning to recover. Her physical therapist noticed the change before anyone else did. She was walking farther. She was standing without assistance for longer periods. Her speech had become stronger, and she was starting to insist on doing things for herself again. The nurses encouraged her progress. Margaret took it as a sign that she would soon be going home. She began talking about what she wanted to do first. She wanted to sit on the porch. She wanted to sleep in her own bed. She wanted to make one of Thomas's old recipes in the kitchen. She even told one of the nurses that she was going to ask Rebecca to help her plant new flowers in the backyard. Then, one afternoon, Margaret noticed something strange. Her daughter had stopped talking about bringing her home. Whenever Margaret mentioned the house, Rebecca changed the subject. "Have you been eating? How are your therapy sessions? Did the doctor say anything about your blood pressure?" Anything except the house. Margaret noticed it, but she didn't accuse her daughter. She didn't want to believe something was wrong. She thought perhaps Rebecca was simply overwhelmed. So Margaret waited. Then she asked a simple question. Rebecca, when can I go home? There was silence. Longer than usual. Finally, Rebecca answered. Mom, I think you need to be realistic. Margaret frowned. Realistic about what? Rebecca took a breath. You can't live alone anymore. Margaret stared at the phone. I've lived there for 40 years. I know. I know my house. That's not the point. Then what is the point? Rebecca didn't answer immediately. And in that silence, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt since the day she entered the nursing facility. Fear. Because for the first time, she wondered whether her daughter had ever intended to bring her home at all. Margaret held the phone against her ear and waited for her daughter to explain. She could hear Rebecca breathing on the other end, but she couldn't hear the confidence that had always been there. Finally, Rebecca said, Mom, you need to understand that things have changed. Margaret looked toward the window of her nursing home room. Outside, the afternoon sun was beginning to disappear behind the trees. Things have changed because I got sick, she replied. That doesn't mean I'm never going home. Rebecca sighed. It's not that simple. Margaret's voice became quieter. Then make it simple for me. Another pause followed. The doctors don't think you should be living alone. Margaret immediately understood what Rebecca was trying to say. The doctors said I needed rehabilitation. They didn't say I couldn't live in my own house. Rebecca didn't respond. Margaret tightened her grip around the phone. Rebecca, what aren't you telling me? This time, her daughter answered with words that Margaret would remember for the rest of her life. You're not going home. Margaret felt as though the room had suddenly become smaller. What did you say? Rebecca repeated herself. You can't go back there. Margaret's voice trembled. Why? Rebecca began listing reasons. The stairs, the maintenance, the possibility of another fall, the fact that Margaret was getting older. Every argument sounded reasonable on its own, but together they created something Margaret couldn't accept. So where am I supposed to live? She asked. Rebecca hesitated. You can stay where you are. Margaret stared at the white walls around her. Here? She asked. For how long? Rebecca didn't give her a number. She simply said, until we figure something out. Margaret knew immediately that something was wrong. She had spent 72 years learning how people sounded when they were telling the truth. And her daughter's voice was different. There was something underneath the words. Something Rebecca didn't want her mother to know. The next morning, Margaret asked one of the nurses if she could make a private phone call. She contacted Linda Harper, her neighbor of nearly 20 years. Linda had been the person who checked on Margaret whenever Thomas was away. She had brought soup after Thomas died and helped Margaret shovel snow during difficult winters. Most importantly, Linda knew the house. She knew the history behind it. Margaret didn't tell her everything immediately. She simply asked a question. Linda, have you noticed anything unusual around my house? Linda became quiet. Then she said, Margaret, I was actually going to call you. Margaret's stomach tightened. Why? Linda explained that trucks had been coming and going. People had been inside the house. A man had taken photographs of the exterior. Someone had even placed a small sign near the front yard for a short period before removing it. Margaret listened without saying a word. When Linda finished, Margaret finally asked, Did Rebecca tell you anything? Linda answered carefully, No, and that's what worried me. Margaret hung up and sat completely still. She looked at the framed photograph of Thomas on her bedside table. For the first time, she wondered whether she had been too trusting. She thought about every recent conversation with Rebecca. Every time her daughter had asked about the house, every time Rebecca had told her not to worry about paperwork, every time she had said, I'll handle it. Margaret suddenly remembered something else. A few weeks before her hospitalization, Rebecca had asked her to sign several documents. She had said they were insurance forms. Margaret hadn't read every page. She trusted her daughter. She remembered signing where Rebecca pointed and returning the papers without asking questions. The memory made Margaret's chest tighten. She immediately called Rebecca again. Did you sell my house? Rebecca didn't answer. That silence was Margaret's answer. Rebecca finally answered. No, Mom, I haven't sold it. Margaret closed her eyes. For a moment, relief returned. Then Rebecca added, Not yet. Those two words changed everything. Margaret sat upright in her nursing home bed. What does that mean? Rebecca's voice became defensive. It means I'm trying to figure out what's best for you. You told me I wasn't going home. Because you can't safely live there anymore. That's not your decision to make. It is when you're not capable of making it yourself. Margaret went silent. That was the first time Rebecca had ever said those words to her. Not capable. Margaret had spent 72 years making her own decisions. She had raised a daughter, managed a household, worked, paid bills, cared for her husband through illness, and maintained the same home for more than 4 decades. She might have been recovering from a medical emergency, but she wasn't confused. She knew where she was. She knew what she owned, and she knew exactly what Rebecca was implying. You think I'm incompetent? I didn't say that. You didn't have to. Rebecca tried to calm her down. Mom, you're making this harder than it needs to be. Margaret's voice shook. Then bring me home. Rebecca didn't answer. Bring me home, Rebecca. Another silence. Then Rebecca said, I can't. Margaret felt the tears come. Why? Rebecca finally said. Because I've already signed the paperwork. Margaret's heart seemed to stop. What paperwork? Rebecca didn't answer. What did you sign? Mom! What did you sign? Rebecca finally whispered. The sale documents. Margaret stared at the photograph of Thomas on her bedside table. You sold my house? Rebecca's voice cracked. I had to. Margaret couldn't speak. She had spent weeks believing she was recovering so she could return home. But while she was learning how to walk again, her daughter had been preparing to make sure there was nowhere for her to return to. Margaret immediately called Daniel Brooks, the attorney who had handled some of Thomas's affairs years earlier. Daniel listened carefully as Margaret explained what Rebecca had told her. Then he asked one question. Margaret, did you personally sign the deed? No. Did you authorize Rebecca to sell the property? Margaret hesitated. I signed something before I went into the hospital. Rebecca told me it was insurance paperwork. Daniel's voice changed. Do you remember exactly what you signed? No. There was another pause. Then Daniel said something that made Margaret's blood run cold. Margaret, I think we need to find out exactly what that document was. And that was when the story stopped being about a daughter making a difficult decision for her elderly mother. Because if Rebecca had used a document Margaret didn't understand to sell the house without her knowledge, this wasn't simply a family disagreement anymore. It could become a legal battle. And Margaret was about to discover that the piece of paper she had signed before entering the hospital might hold the answer to everything. Daniel didn't tell Margaret what he suspected. He knew better than to make an accusation before seeing the paperwork. Instead, he asked her to give him permission to investigate the property records and obtain copies of any documents Rebecca had filed. Margaret agreed immediately. She was frightened, but beneath the fear was something stronger now: determination. She had spent weeks trusting her daughter because she believed there had to be an innocent explanation. Now she wasn't so sure. The following morning, Daniel contacted the county recorder's office and requested the most recent records associated with Margaret's property. When the documents arrived, he began reading them carefully. The first pages appeared ordinary: property information, tax records, previous ownership history. Then he reached the most recent filing. Daniel stopped. He read it once, then again. He adjusted his glasses and looked at the signature page. The document appeared to transfer Margaret's property to a buyer, but something immediately caught his attention. The signature authorizing the transaction wasn't Margaret's name alone. Rebecca had signed on her mother's behalf under a power of attorney. Daniel recognized the document number referenced in the filing, but he needed to see the original power of attorney before he could determine whether Rebecca had actually possessed the authority she claimed. He contacted the office that had recorded it and requested a certified copy. When it arrived, Daniel studied every page. The document gave Rebecca certain authority to manage her mother's financial affairs, but there was a crucial limitation. It did not clearly authorize her to sell Margaret's primary residence without specific consent. Daniel leaned back in his chair. That distinction could change everything. If Rebecca had sold the property without the authority required under the document, the transaction could potentially be challenged. But there was another problem. The buyer had already paid a substantial deposit. The closing date was approaching, and if the sale went through, reversing everything could become far more complicated. Daniel called Margaret. There is something you need to know, he said. Margaret listened carefully. The power of attorney Rebecca used may not give her the authority she believes it does. Margaret's voice was quiet. What does that mean? It means we need to move quickly. Margaret looked toward the photograph of her house on the bedside table. Can you stop the sale? I can't promise that yet. Then what can you promise? Daniel paused. I can promise that we're going to find out exactly what happened. For the first time since entering the nursing facility, Margaret felt that she wasn't completely powerless. But Daniel wasn't finished. He had asked the county records office for one more document, the original filing associated with the power of attorney. When he received it, he noticed something that made him question the entire timeline. The document had been notarized only days before Margaret entered the hospital. That alone wasn't proof of wrongdoing. But according to Margaret, she had been heavily medicated during that period and barely remembered signing anything. Daniel began looking at the date again. Then he looked at the date of the property listing. The listing had appeared before Margaret had even entered the nursing home. That meant Rebecca had been preparing to sell the house while Margaret was still living there. And suddenly, the question was no longer whether Rebecca had decided to sell her mother's home after the hospitalization. The question was much more disturbing. How long had she been planning it? Daniel spent the next several hours reconstructing the timeline. He started with the date Margaret entered the hospital. Then he looked at the date she was transferred to the rehabilitation facility. Finally, he compared both dates with the property records and the real estate listing. The more he compared them, the more troubling the picture became. The house had been photographed and quietly prepared for sale before Margaret had even left her home for the hospital. That meant Rebecca hadn't simply reacted to her mother's illness. She had already been taking steps toward selling the property. Daniel printed the records and placed them side by side on his desk. There were gaps, but there were also dates that were difficult to explain. A real estate valuation had been requested before Margaret's hospitalization. A preliminary listing had been prepared while Margaret was still recovering in the hospital, and the power of attorney had been notarized during the same period. None of those things proved exactly what Rebecca intended, but together they created a pattern Margaret could no longer ignore. Daniel called Linda Harper next. He asked whether she remembered seeing anyone around Margaret's house before the hospitalization. Linda thought carefully. Then she remembered something she hadn't considered important at the time. About 2 weeks before Margaret collapsed, a man had visited the property with Rebecca. He had walked around the exterior with a measuring device and taken photographs. Linda had assumed he was a contractor. She remembered asking Rebecca about him. Rebecca had simply said they were taking care of a few things around the house. Linda hadn't questioned it. Now, however, she realized that the visit had occurred before Margaret's medical emergency. When Daniel asked whether Linda would be willing to provide a statement, she agreed. She also told him something else. A few days before Margaret entered the hospital, Rebecca had asked her whether she thought Margaret would ever consider moving somewhere smaller. Linda remembered being surprised by the question because Margaret had never talked about selling. Daniel thanked her and ended the call. Then he made another discovery. The real estate agent who had visited the house wasn't simply preparing a valuation. He had already communicated with a potential buyer. The buyer was a local investor who specialized in purchasing older suburban properties, renovating them, and reselling them. According to the correspondence Daniel obtained, the investor had been interested in Margaret's house because of its location and lot size. He had apparently been told that the owner was elderly and that a family representative was handling the transaction. That phrase bothered Daniel. Family representative. It suggested that Rebecca had deliberately presented herself as someone authorized to act for Margaret. Daniel now had to determine whether the buyer knew Margaret was unaware of the sale. Meanwhile, Margaret sat alone in her nursing home room, staring at the photograph of her house. She remembered the morning she had left, the coffee mug on the kitchen floor, the ambulance waiting outside, Rebecca standing beside her. At the time, she had thought she was leaving for a few weeks. She had even asked Rebecca to make sure the plants were watered. Now she wondered whether Rebecca had looked around that kitchen that morning and already known that her mother might never see it again. The thought broke something inside her. Margaret wasn't angry because she wanted money. She was angry because the house represented trust. She had trusted Rebecca to protect what Thomas and she had spent their lives building. Instead, Rebecca had apparently been preparing to take it away while Margaret was still living inside it. That evening, Daniel called Margaret again. "There is something else," he said. Margaret immediately knew from his voice that it wasn't good. What is it? Daniel hesitated. The buyer is scheduled to close soon. Margaret swallowed hard. How soon? 3 days. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Margaret asked the question that had been sitting in her mind since the beginning. Can we stop it? Daniel looked at the documents spread across his desk. I think we have a chance. A chance isn't enough. I know. Then what do we do? Daniel's voice became firm. We challenge the transaction before closing. Margaret looked down at her hands. For the first time, she wasn't waiting for Rebecca to rescue her. She was preparing to fight her. 3 days. That was all the time Margaret had before the house she had lived in for more than 40 years could legally change hands. Daniel immediately began preparing the paperwork needed to challenge the transaction, but he warned Margaret that the situation was complicated. A signed contract existed, a buyer was expecting to close, and Rebecca had presented herself as Margaret's legal representative. If they wanted to stop the sale, they needed to act quickly and establish that Rebecca had exceeded her authority. Margaret listened carefully. She wasn't interested in revenge. She wanted her home back. She wanted the chance to walk through the front door again, without wondering whether someone else had replaced the locks. She wanted to sit in Thomas's chair and know that she still had control over the life she had built. Daniel told her that they also needed evidence showing that Margaret had never agreed to sell. Margaret immediately thought of Linda. She also remembered something else, the folder Thomas had kept in the home office. The next morning, Linda went to Margaret's house with permission from Daniel to look for the old records. She had known Margaret long enough to understand exactly where Thomas kept important documents. In the home office, she opened the filing cabinet and began searching through folders, tax returns, insurance policies, medical records, old bank statements. Then, at the bottom of a drawer, she found a thick envelope marked with Thomas's handwriting. Linda immediately called Daniel. I found something, she said. Daniel asked her not to open anything until he could examine it properly. Inside the envelope were copies of the original property documents, along with a handwritten note from Thomas, dated several years earlier. The note wasn't a legal document by itself, but it contained something important. Thomas had written that Margaret was to remain the sole decision-maker regarding the house for as long as she was capable of managing her own affairs. It was not enough to settle the dispute, but it provided context. More importantly, beneath the note was a copy of an older estate planning document. Daniel examined it carefully. Then he found the sentence that changed the direction of the case. The document stated that if Margaret became unable to manage her affairs temporarily, her designated representative was expected to preserve her primary residence unless Margaret expressly authorized its sale. Daniel read the sentence twice. It didn't automatically cancel the transaction, but it gave him another argument. Rebecca hadn't simply been given unlimited control over everything her mother owned. Her authority came with conditions, and if Margaret had never authorized the sale, Rebecca could have violated those conditions. But there was still one question. Why had Rebecca been preparing to sell the house before Margaret ever became seriously ill? Daniel needed the answer, so he contacted the real estate agent. At first, the agent was reluctant to discuss the transaction. He said Rebecca had told him she was acting under a valid power of attorney, and that he had no reason to believe otherwise. But when Daniel asked whether Rebecca had discussed Margaret's health before the property was listed, the agent paused. Finally, he admitted that Rebecca had told him her mother was probably going to need permanent care. Daniel asked when she had said that. The agent gave him a date. It was 9 days before Margaret's hospitalization. And Daniel slowly put down his pen. 9 days. That meant Rebecca had apparently been discussing permanent care for her mother before the medical emergency that supposedly made the nursing home necessary. Daniel asked one final question. Did Rebecca ever tell you that her mother had agreed to sell the house? The agent answered honestly. She told me her mother wouldn't be coming back. Daniel ended the call. Then he sat quietly for several seconds. Because that sentence changed everything. Rebecca hadn't simply decided that Margaret couldn't return home after she became sick. She may have already been planning for Margaret to stay somewhere else. And if that was true, Margaret's hospitalization hadn't created the plan. It had simply given Rebecca the opportunity to carry it out. Margaret spent that night awake. The nursing home was quiet, but her mind wouldn't stop moving. She kept returning to the same sentence Daniel had repeated to her. Rebecca had told the real estate agent that her mother would not be coming back home. Margaret couldn't understand how her daughter could have been so certain. She had been in the hospital for only a short time. Even the doctors hadn't known exactly how quickly she would recover. Yet Rebecca apparently had already been speaking about permanent care before Margaret's collapse. Margaret began remembering small things that had seemed meaningless at the time. Rebecca asking about the value of the house. Rebecca asking whether Thomas had left any outstanding debts. Rebecca becoming unusually interested in Margaret's financial paperwork. Rebecca suggesting that the house was becoming too much, months before the hospitalization. Margaret had dismissed all of it because she trusted her daughter. Now those memories were forming a picture she didn't want to see. The following morning, Daniel arranged for Margaret to speak with the nursing home's social worker. Margaret explained that she wanted to leave the facility as soon as she was medically cleared. The social worker asked whether she had somewhere safe to go. Margaret answered without hesitation, "My house." The woman looked at her notes and then carefully explained that Rebecca had been listed as Margaret's primary family contact and had expressed concerns about her mother's ability to live independently. Margaret felt a wave of anger. "She doesn't get to decide that," she said. The social worker remained professional and told her that no one was preventing Margaret from expressing her wishes, but there were procedures that had to be followed. Margaret understood. For the first time, she realized how much power Rebecca had gained simply by being the person who spoke on her behalf while she was hospitalized. Margaret had trusted her daughter to communicate her wishes. Instead, Rebecca had apparently been communicating her own. Daniel continued investigating. He obtained another set of records from the county. This time, he found a preliminary purchase agreement. The buyer's name was listed. The purchase price was listed, and there, on the signature page, was Rebecca's name. Margaret stared at a copy Daniel had sent her. She didn't recognize the buyer. She didn't recognize the date, but she recognized something else. The proposed closing date was less than a week away. Daniel explained that they were preparing an emergency legal filing to challenge the transaction. He couldn't guarantee the court would stop the sale immediately, but the evidence gave them enough grounds to request intervention. Margaret asked what would happen if they lost. Daniel answered carefully, "Then we may have to fight to recover the property after the sale." Margaret closed her eyes. The thought of fighting for her own home made her feel exhausted. Then Daniel asked if she was ready to confront Rebecca. Margaret hesitated. For weeks, she had wanted an explanation. Now she was afraid of hearing it. Still, she agreed. Rebecca arrived at the nursing home that afternoon. She walked into Margaret's room carrying a small paper bag from the cafe they both used to love. For a moment, everything looked normal. Rebecca smiled. "Hi, Mom." Margaret looked at her daughter. She didn't smile back. Instead, she asked quietly, "Why did you tell the realtor I wasn't coming home?" Rebecca froze. The paper bag slipped slightly in her hand. And for the first time since this began, Margaret saw something in her daughter's face that frightened her more than anger ever could. Recognition. Rebecca knew her mother had found out. Rebecca stood in the doorway, still holding the small paper bag from the cafe. Margaret watched her carefully. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Then Rebecca placed the bag on the table and sat down. "Mom, I didn't want you to find out this way." Margaret's voice was quiet. "Then tell me the truth." Rebecca looked away. "I was scared." Margaret waited. "Scared of what?" Rebecca finally looked back at her. "I thought you were going to die." Margaret's expression softened for only a moment. "I almost did," she said. "But I didn't." Rebecca nodded. "I know." Margaret leaned forward. "Then why did you sell my house?" Rebecca swallowed. "Because I thought I was going to lose you, and I didn't know what I was supposed to do." Margaret stared at her daughter. "You could have asked me." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. "You wouldn't have agreed." Margaret answered immediately. "That was my decision to make." Rebecca looked down at her hands. Then she admitted something she had never told her mother. She had been struggling financially for months. Her debts had become overwhelming, and she had fallen behind on several payments. She had borrowed money from people she couldn't repay. She had even received warnings that she could lose her apartment. She said she had initially intended to ask Margaret for help, but she was ashamed. Then, after seeing how much the house was worth, she began convincing herself that selling it would solve everything. She told herself that Margaret would eventually need long-term care anyway, and the money from the house could pay for it. She said she thought she was protecting her mother from the burden of managing the property. But Margaret wasn't listening to the excuses anymore. She was listening for one thing: remorse. "Did you ever plan to bring me home?" she asked. Rebecca didn't answer. That silence hurt more than anything Rebecca had said. Margaret looked toward the window. "You made the decision before I even went into that hospital, didn't you?" Rebecca began crying. "I didn't know how bad things were going to get." Margaret shook her head. "That's not what I asked." Rebecca wiped her face. "Yes." The word was barely audible. Margaret closed her eyes. "You had already decided." Rebecca nodded. "I thought you would eventually understand." Margaret looked back at her. "Understand what? That you planned my future while I was still living in my own home?" Rebecca said she had never intended to hurt her. She said she believed the nursing facility would be safer. She said she thought Margaret would eventually accept it, but Margaret could no longer separate concern from control. The nursing home had not been the worst part. The worst part was that Rebecca had used Margaret's vulnerability to make a decision she knew her mother would never willingly make. Then Margaret asked the question Rebecca had been avoiding. "How much were you going to get?" Rebecca didn't answer. Margaret's voice became firmer. "How much?" Rebecca finally whispered the amount. Margaret stared at her. It wasn't the entire sale price. Rebecca had already arranged for part of the money to cover her debts. And that was when Margaret understood. This had never been only about her mother's safety. It had also been about Rebecca saving herself. Margaret sat quietly after Rebecca admitted what she had done with the money. She didn't shout. She didn't insult her daughter. Somehow, the calmness made the moment heavier. She simply asked, "How much have you already taken?" Rebecca looked down. She had used a portion of the money to pay overdue debts and settle accounts she had been hiding for months. She insisted she intended to replace it after getting back on her feet. Margaret listened, but there was one detail she couldn't accept. "You were going to replace it?" she asked. "With what?" Rebecca had no answer. Margaret looked at her daughter and realized that Rebecca hadn't created a plan for returning the money, because she had never truly believed she would need to. She had convinced herself that the house was eventually going to be hers anyway. That belief had allowed her to cross one boundary after another, until the thing she once called temporary had become a completed sale. Daniel arrived shortly afterward with the documents needed for the emergency filing. Margaret signed the authorization for him to proceed. He explained that the legal process could take time, and there were no guarantees, but the immediate goal was to prevent the closing from happening. Rebecca sat quietly while he explained everything. When Daniel finished, Margaret looked at her daughter. "If you had told me you were in trouble, I would have helped you." Rebecca began crying again. "I was ashamed." Margaret shook her head. "You should have been ashamed of what you did to me, not of asking for help." Rebecca had no response. For years, Margaret had believed her daughter was strong because she never complained. Now she realized Rebecca's silence had hidden problems Margaret never knew existed. But understanding why someone betrayed you doesn't erase the betrayal. The following morning, Daniel filed the emergency request. The buyer was notified that the transaction was being challenged. The real estate agent was ordered to preserve the relevant records. For the first time, the closing date became uncertain. Margaret waited anxiously for news. Meanwhile, the buyer's attorney contacted Daniel and argued that the buyer had entered the agreement in good faith. He claimed the buyer had no reason to believe Rebecca lacked authority. Daniel responded that the matter was precisely what needed to be determined. If Rebecca had exceeded her authority, the buyer's good intentions wouldn't automatically resolve the issue. The case was becoming more complicated by the hour. Margaret knew that even if she won, the relationship with her daughter might never return to what it had been. Then Daniel received an email from the realtor. There was an attachment. It contained an early version of the property listing. Daniel opened it. The date at the top was several weeks before Margaret's hospitalization. He stared at the screen. Rebecca hadn't merely prepared to sell the house after Margaret became ill. She had prepared for the sale before the medical emergency ever happened. Daniel printed the document and brought it to Margaret. She looked at the date. Then she looked at Rebecca. "Why?" Margaret asked. Rebecca couldn't answer. And for the first time, Margaret understood that the nursing home had never been the beginning of this story. It was only the moment when Rebecca believed her mother could no longer stop what she had already started. Margaret couldn't stop looking at the date on the listing. She remembered that week clearly. She had been complaining about feeling unusually tired, but she was still living independently. She had gone grocery shopping, paid her bills, spoken to Linda over the phone, and even made plans to attend a church gathering that weekend. Nothing about her condition suggested that she was preparing to leave her home permanently. Yet Rebecca had apparently been planning a sale before Margaret ever entered the hospital. Daniel asked Margaret whether Rebecca had ever mentioned a realtor during that period. Margaret shook her head. Then she remembered something. Rebecca had asked her to sign several papers at the kitchen table. She had said they were related to insurance and medical planning. Margaret had trusted her daughter and signed where she was told. Daniel immediately asked whether Rebecca had been present when the documents were signed. Margaret nodded. She sat right beside me. Daniel asked whether anyone else had been there. Margaret thought for a moment. There was a notary. That detail changed the investigation. Daniel requested the notary records. If the power of attorney had been signed legally, the notary would have documented the date, identification, and circumstances surrounding the signature. When the records arrived, Daniel noticed something unusual. The document had been signed at Margaret's home, but the notary's log contained a notation stating that Margaret appeared confused during the appointment. Daniel stared at that sentence for several seconds. A notary could not determine medical capacity, but the notation raised questions about whether Margaret understood what she was signing. Daniel contacted the notary and asked for a statement. The notary remembered Rebecca being unusually insistent about completing the paperwork quickly. She also remembered Margaret repeatedly asking what the document was for. Rebecca had answered for her mother, saying it was simply authorization for financial assistance during Margaret's recovery. Margaret had apparently accepted the explanation. When Daniel told Margaret what the notary had remembered, Margaret covered her face with both hands. She wasn't crying because she was surprised anymore. She was crying because she finally understood how easily her trust had been used. She remembered the afternoon, Rebecca sitting beside her, the notary explaining that she needed to sign several pages, Rebecca reassuring her that everything was routine. Margaret had never imagined that one of those pages could eventually be used to transfer control over her home. She had signed because she trusted the person sitting beside her. That realization was more painful than the possibility of losing the house itself. Daniel told her they now had stronger grounds to challenge the transaction, but he warned her that the legal process could still be difficult. The buyer might fight. Rebecca might face serious consequences, and Margaret would have to decide whether she wanted to pursue the matter against her own daughter. That evening, Rebecca returned to Margaret's room. She didn't bring coffee. She didn't bring flowers. She simply sat down. For several minutes, neither woman spoke. Then Rebecca said, "I know I can't undo it." Margaret looked at her. "No, you can't." Rebecca began crying. "I was desperate." Margaret's voice remained calm. "You were my daughter." Rebecca nodded. "I know. And I trusted you. I know." Margaret looked away. "That was the one thing you were supposed to protect." Rebecca had no answer. Then she reached into her purse and placed a small envelope on the table. Margaret looked at it. "What is that?" Rebecca whispered. "Everything I have left." Margaret didn't touch it, because whatever was inside that envelope, she knew it couldn't buy back the years of trust her daughter had destroyed. Margaret stared at the envelope for several seconds before finally reaching for it. It was thin, almost weightless. She expected money, perhaps a check or some kind of statement showing what Rebecca had left after paying her debts. Instead, when Margaret opened it, she found a handwritten letter. Her daughter's handwriting covered both sides of the page. Margaret began reading silently. Rebecca had written that she knew what she had done was wrong. She admitted that she had convinced herself the house would eventually belong to her anyway, and that this belief had made it easier to justify each decision. She wrote about the debt, the fear, the embarrassment, and the pressure she had been carrying. But there was one sentence that made Margaret stop reading. Rebecca wrote that she had been afraid her mother would discover how badly she was struggling and look at her differently. Margaret lowered the letter. She understood the fear. What she couldn't understand was why Rebecca had chosen deception instead of asking for help. Rebecca sat across from her mother, waiting. "Did you write this before or after I found out about the sale?" Margaret asked. "After. So you knew you had to tell me." "Yes. But you still didn't." Rebecca lowered her head. Margaret looked back at the letter. For years, she had taught Rebecca that mistakes could be forgiven when people admitted them and took responsibility. But this wasn't one mistake. There had been dozens of decisions. The conversations with the realtor, the paperwork, the power of attorney, the nursing home arrangement, the property listing, the buyer, the money. Each step had required another decision to continue. Margaret realized that Rebecca hadn't simply lost control one afternoon. She had repeatedly chosen a path that led directly to this moment. Then Rebecca said something Margaret hadn't expected. "I never thought you'd fight me." Margaret looked up. "Why?" "Because you're my mother." Margaret almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Exactly." Rebecca looked confused. Margaret continued. "You thought because I loved you, I wouldn't defend myself." Rebecca began crying. "That wasn't what I meant." But that's what happened. The room became silent. Outside the window, the afternoon light was fading. Margaret looked at her daughter and realized that the woman sitting across from her was still the little girl who had once run through the same house chasing a ball. She could still remember Rebecca's first Christmas there, her first day of school, the night Thomas taught her how to ride a bicycle. Those memories hadn't disappeared because of what Rebecca had done. But something had changed. Margaret could no longer confuse love with trust. She could love her daughter and still hold her accountable. The next morning, Daniel called. His voice sounded different. The judge reviewed the emergency filing. Margaret held her breath. "The closing has been temporarily blocked." Margaret closed her eyes. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to breathe. Her house was still hers, at least for now. But Daniel wasn't finished. "There is one more issue," he said. Margaret opened her eyes. "What issue?" "The buyer's attorney found another document." Margaret's stomach tightened. "What document?" Daniel paused. "A second power of attorney. And this one," he said, "appeared to have been signed months before the first one." The news about the second power of attorney changed the case completely. Margaret had never heard of it. Daniel explained that the document appeared to have been created months earlier, long before her hospitalization, and long before Rebecca had told anyone that her mother could no longer manage her own affairs. According to the document, Rebecca had been given broader authority to handle certain financial matters. But there was a problem. The signature looked different from the one on the document Margaret remembered signing. Daniel didn't want to make an accusation based on appearance alone, so he arranged for the original document to be examined. Margaret sat quietly while he explained what would happen next. She felt exhausted. Every new discovery seemed to reveal another layer of something she had never known about her own daughter. She had once believed the worst thing that could happen was losing her home. Now she was beginning to realize that the house had only been the visible part of a much larger betrayal. The document was sent to a handwriting specialist for examination. The specialist compared the signature on the second power of attorney with several verified samples of Margaret's handwriting from the same period. The conclusion wasn't immediate, but the differences were significant enough to warrant further investigation. Certain letters were formed differently. The pressure of the pen appeared inconsistent. Most importantly, the specialist couldn't confirm that Margaret herself had signed the document. Daniel explained that this didn't automatically prove forgery, but it meant the document couldn't simply be accepted as legitimate without further scrutiny. If Rebecca had relied on a questionable document to claim authority over her mother's property, the consequences could become much more serious. Margaret listened quietly. Then she asked Daniel the question she had been afraid to ask. "If I didn't sign it, who did?" Daniel looked at her. "That's what we need to find out." The answer began with the notary listed on the document. Daniel contacted the notary and provided a copy. The notary immediately recognized the record, but became confused when Daniel asked about Margaret's presence. According to the notary's journal, the document had been signed in a location Margaret had never visited. Margaret confirmed that she had never been there. She had never met the notary. She had never signed anything in that office. Daniel asked whether the notary could identify the person who appeared before her. The notary explained that identification had been recorded, but she could not remember the individual personally. She agreed to provide the official journal entry. Daniel obtained it the same day. The name written in the identification section wasn't Margaret's. It was Rebecca's. Daniel stared at the page. Then he called Margaret. "Margaret, I need you to stay calm." She immediately knew something was wrong. "What happened?" "The person who appeared before the notary wasn't you." Margaret's heart began pounding. Then who was it? Daniel took a breath. According to the record, it was Rebecca. Margaret couldn't speak. For several seconds, there was nothing but silence. Then Margaret whispered, "My daughter signed my name?" Daniel carefully explained that they still needed to establish exactly what happened and whether Rebecca had knowingly misrepresented herself. But the evidence was becoming difficult to dismiss. The second power of attorney appeared to have been created months before the sale. Rebecca had then relied on it while preparing the property transaction, and now there was a documented record placing Rebecca at the notary's office instead of Margaret. Margaret put the phone down and stared at the photograph of her husband. She had spent her entire life teaching her daughter to be honest. And now the person she had trusted most had apparently forged the very authority she used to take away her mother's home. But the biggest question remained unanswered. Why had Rebecca created the second power of attorney months before Margaret ever became sick? The answer began with something Margaret had almost forgotten. Several months before her hospitalization, Rebecca had asked her mother to meet for lunch. At the time, Margaret thought it was simply a chance for the two of them to spend time together. But during that lunch, Rebecca had started asking unusually specific questions about Margaret's finances. She wanted to know how much money was in her savings account, whether the house was completely paid off, where the insurance policies were kept, and whether Thomas had left anything that could create complications later. Margaret had answered some of the questions, but she had also laughed and told Rebecca she was becoming too curious. Rebecca had smiled and said she was only trying to make sure everything was organized. Margaret never thought more about it. Now, however, those questions looked very different. Daniel began examining Rebecca's financial records, with the appropriate legal permissions, to determine whether her financial problems had started before the attempted sale. What he discovered explained why Rebecca might have been thinking about her mother's assets months before Margaret became ill. Rebecca's debts had not appeared suddenly. They had been building for more than a year. She had accumulated credit card balances, taken out personal loans, and borrowed money from people close to her. Her financial situation had deteriorated after a business venture she had invested in failed. She hadn't told Margaret because she was embarrassed. Instead, she had tried to maintain the appearance that everything was fine. Eventually, several creditors began demanding payment. Rebecca had reached a point where she needed a large amount of money quickly. That was when she began looking at the house differently. She knew the property was Margaret's most valuable asset. She also knew that her mother trusted her. At first, Rebecca apparently considered asking Margaret to sell the house voluntarily, but she knew her mother would refuse. Margaret had repeatedly said that she wanted to remain there for the rest of her life. So Rebecca began looking for another way. The second power of attorney suddenly made sense. Rebecca had apparently created it as a backup. If Margaret refused to sell, Rebecca could claim she had authority to act on her behalf. If Margaret became sick, Rebecca would have even more control. And if Margaret ever became unable to challenge the transaction quickly, Rebecca could move forward before anyone realized what had happened. The plan had been designed months before the hospitalization. Margaret's medical emergency simply created the perfect opportunity. Daniel explained that this was now far more serious than a dispute over a property sale. If the evidence showed that Rebecca knowingly forged her mother's signature or misrepresented herself to a notary, the matter could potentially involve criminal allegations. Margaret listened in silence. She had spent the entire investigation hoping there was some explanation that would make her daughter's actions understandable. Now there was one. Rebecca had been desperate for money, but desperation did not explain everything. It explained the motive. It didn't excuse the choices. Then investigators found something even more important. The original copy of the second power of attorney contained a handwritten note on the final page. The note appeared to have been written by Rebecca herself. It wasn't addressed to Margaret, and it wasn't part of the legal document. It simply contained a reminder about the property and an instruction to wait until she is in care. Daniel read the words again. Wait until she is in care. Margaret stared at the page. Her face changed. Because that sentence meant the nursing home wasn't merely part of the aftermath. It may have been part of the plan. Rebecca hadn't simply seen an opportunity when Margaret became vulnerable. She may have been waiting for that vulnerability to arrive. And suddenly, the question was no longer whether Rebecca had betrayed her mother. The question was how much of Margaret's future had been planned before Margaret even knew she was in danger. The handwritten note was enough for Daniel to request a deeper investigation, But Margaret needed more than suspicion. She needed to know what had happened before she entered the nursing home. Daniel contacted the realtor again and asked for every communication involving Rebecca, including emails, text messages, and appointment records. At first, the realtor hesitated. Then he agreed. Buried among dozens of routine messages was one conversation dated nearly 3 weeks before Margaret's hospitalization. Rebecca had asked how quickly the house could be sold if the owner were unable to return home. The realtor had replied that the process depended on the owner's legal authority and the buyer, but that they could begin preparing immediately. Rebecca's response was short. She wrote, "That's what I'm trying to arrange." Margaret read the message in silence. She had been sitting in her own kitchen when Rebecca wrote it. She had been alive, independent, and completely unaware that her daughter was already discussing how to sell her home. Then Daniel found another message. This one was between Rebecca and a friend. Rebecca had written that she was running out of options, and that once her mother was placed somewhere permanently, she could finally deal with the house. The friend apparently asked whether Margaret knew about the plan. Rebecca responded with 3 words. "She doesn't need to." Those words devastated Margaret more than the property records had. Her daughter hadn't simply made a desperate decision. She had discussed it with other people while deliberately keeping Margaret in the dark. For years, Margaret had believed that family meant protecting one another when life became difficult. Rebecca had apparently interpreted family as having access to something because she was the person closest to it. Daniel explained that the evidence was now strong enough to support a serious legal challenge. He also recommended that Margaret formally revoke every power of attorney Rebecca might possess. Margaret agreed. She signed the necessary documents and instructed Daniel to make sure Rebecca could no longer make financial or property decisions on her behalf. Then came the confrontation. Rebecca was called into a meeting with Daniel and Margaret. She arrived expecting another conversation about the house. Instead, Daniel placed copies of the messages, the disputed power of attorney, the realtor's records, and the handwritten note on the table. Rebecca stared at them. Margaret didn't raise her voice. She simply asked, "How long were you planning this?" Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know." Margaret shook her head. "You knew enough to write, 'Wait until she is in care.'" Rebecca looked at the note. Then she whispered something that Margaret never expected to hear. "I didn't think you'd ever find out." Margaret stared at her daughter. And in that moment, the betrayal became complete. Rebecca hadn't been waiting for her mother to recover. She had been waiting for her mother to become powerless. The legal battle moved faster after the new evidence surfaced. Rebecca's attorney advised her to cooperate with the investigation, and the buyer withdrew from the transaction rather than become involved in a dispute over the property's ownership. The sale was stopped before closing. Margaret's house remained legally hers. But winning the property back on paper wasn't the same as getting her life back. She still had to leave the nursing facility, regain her independence, and face the reality that her daughter had deliberately placed her there. Daniel helped arrange for Margaret to receive an independent assessment of her ability to live alone. The evaluation found that she was capable of making her own decisions and could return home with limited assistance. When Margaret heard the news, she cried. Not because she had won the legal battle, but because someone had finally listened to what she had been saying from the beginning. She wasn't asking to be rescued. She was asking to be heard. A week later, Margaret stood outside her house for the first time in months. Linda was beside her. The front door looked exactly as it always had, but Margaret felt like a stranger approaching it. She reached into her purse and pulled out her key. For a moment, her hand trembled. Then she inserted it into the lock and turned it. The door opened. The smell of the house rushed back immediately. The kitchen, the wooden floors, the photographs, Thomas's chair. Everything was still there, although some of his belongings had been moved. Margaret walked slowly through each room. She touched the kitchen counter where she had made thousands of meals. She stood beneath the doorway where Thomas had marked Rebecca's height. Then she entered the living room and sat in his old chair. Linda stood nearby, watching quietly. Margaret closed her eyes. She had imagined this moment so many times while lying in that nursing home bed, but she hadn't imagined how complicated it would feel, because the house had been returned to her, but the trust hadn't. Rebecca eventually faced the consequences of her actions. The property transaction was formally abandoned, the questionable documents were investigated, and the financial arrangements she had made using the anticipated proceeds had to be undone. Margaret chose not to pursue the harshest possible punishment against her daughter, but she also refused to pretend nothing had happened. She revoked Rebecca's authority over her affairs and placed her financial and legal decisions under the supervision of an independent professional. It was a painful decision, but Margaret understood something she had never understood before. Forgiveness did not require giving someone access to hurt you again. Months later, Rebecca came to Margaret's house. She stood on the porch for several minutes before knocking. Margaret opened the door. They looked at each other. Rebecca began to cry. "I'm sorry, Mom." Margaret believed that she was sorry, but forgiveness would take time. Margaret finally stepped aside and allowed her daughter into the house. Not because everything was fixed, not because the betrayal had disappeared, but because Margaret had decided that what Rebecca had done would not determine the rest of her life. She had lost her sense of security. She had lost the trust she once placed completely in her daughter. But she had not lost herself. And when she finally sat beneath the maple tree in her own backyard again, Margaret understood something that would stay with her for the rest of her life. Sometimes the people closest to us know exactly where our trust is strongest. And sometimes, that is precisely where we need to be most careful. For the first few months after returning home, Margaret changed the way she lived. She installed a medical alert system, arranged for someone to help with certain household tasks, and kept copies of every important document in a secure location outside the house. She also made one decision that was difficult but necessary. No single person would ever again have complete control over her finances, property, and personal affairs. Daniel helped her organize everything properly, and Linda became one of the people Margaret trusted to check on her regularly. The changes weren't about living in fear. They were about understanding that independence sometimes requires preparation. Margaret had spent years believing that family was enough protection. Now she understood that love and legal protection were two different things. You could love someone deeply and still make sure your affairs were protected. Rebecca's relationship with her mother changed too. There were no more casual visits where everything felt effortless. Their conversations became shorter and more careful. Rebecca eventually entered financial counseling and began working to repay what she owed. She apologized many times, but Margaret never allowed apologies to replace accountability. Slowly, however, something unexpected happened. Rebecca began showing up without asking for anything. She brought groceries. She helped with repairs. She sat with her mother when she was lonely. She didn't ask about the house. She didn't ask about money. She simply came. Margaret noticed the difference. Trust did not return overnight, and perhaps it never returned in exactly the same form. But over time, Margaret began to see that her daughter was finally learning the lesson she had been forced to learn the hard way. One afternoon, nearly a year after the incident, Margaret and Rebecca sat together beneath the maple tree in the backyard, the same tree that had been there when Rebecca was a little girl. Margaret looked at her daughter and said, "You know what hurt the most?" Rebecca looked down. "The house?" Margaret shook her head. "No, I could have lost the house and rebuilt somewhere else. What hurt was realizing that while I was lying in that hospital believing you were protecting me, you were making plans for the day I couldn't protect myself." Rebecca cried quietly. Margaret reached across the table and held her hand. "I love you," she said. "But loving you doesn't mean I stop protecting myself." Rebecca nodded. It was probably the first time she truly understood what her mother meant. Margaret never forgot what happened. She didn't want to. Forgetting would have meant ignoring the warning hidden inside her own experience. She learned that vulnerability can arrive suddenly. A hospital stay can change how other people perceive your independence. A familiar person can become the person making decisions when you're unable to speak for yourself. And sometimes, the most important documents in your life are the ones you never remember signing. Margaret had been fortunate. She had a friend who noticed something was wrong, an attorney who took her concerns seriously, and enough evidence to challenge what had happened before the sale was completed. Many people never get that opportunity. Her house remained hers. The porch remained hers. Thomas's chair remained in the living room. And every morning, Margaret still walked into her kitchen and made coffee exactly the way she had for decades. But there was one thing she did differently. She kept the front door unlocked for the people she loved, but she never again left the key to her future in someone else's hands. Because sometimes betrayal doesn't begin with a stranger. Sometimes it begins with someone who already knows your birthday, your favorite meal, the name of your first love, where you keep your important papers, and exactly how much you trust them. And perhaps that is why Margaret's story isn't really about a house. It is about what happens when love makes us stop asking questions. It is about the difference between being cared for and being controlled. And it is about remembering that growing older should never mean surrendering your right to decide what happens to your own life. So if there is one thing Margaret would want another person to remember, it is this. Trust the people you love, but don't give away your ability to protect yourself. Because Margaret almost lost the home she had spent 43 years building. But in the end, she discovered something far more important. She still had a voice, she still had a choice, and she was still the person who had the right to decide where she belonged. But now I want to hear from you. If you were in Margaret's position, would you have forgiven Rebecca after everything she did? Do you think Rebecca was simply desperate and made a terrible decision, or do you believe she deliberately took advantage of her mother's vulnerability? And here's the question I think matters most. If someone you loved put you in a nursing home without your permission, so they could sell your home, would you ever trust that person again? Tell me what you think in the comments. I genuinely want to hear your perspective, because sometimes the most powerful part of a story isn't what happened to the person in it, but what we would have done if we were in their place. And if Margaret's story made you stop and think about the people you trust, share this video with someone who might need to hear it. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Shadows of Trust, and turn on notifications so you never miss another story of betrayal, deception, and the secrets people keep from those closest to them. Because sometimes, the person standing beside you isn't the person you should fear. Sometimes, they're the person you trusted enough to never question. And that's what makes betrayal hurt the most. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.